As we're talking about relationships in this series, I think one of the greatest reasons that many relationships fail is this area, the area of understanding one another, whether we are seeking understanding or we are seeking to be understood by someone else. Relationships break down when understanding goes out the door. In fact, I read something just the other day that your success at your job has a lot to do with understanding. Even in the marketplace, at your work, a lot of your success has to do in the area of listening and understanding other people. A few years ago, David Burns, a psychiatrist with the University of Pennsylvania, wrote something that is just really eye-opening about this whole area of understanding. He said this, he said, the biggest mistake you can make at your job, the biggest mistake you can make in trying to talk convincingly is to put your highest priority on expressing your ideas and feelings. What most people really want is to be listened to be respected, and to be understood. And the moment that people see that they are being understood, they become more motivated to listen to your point of view and to understand your point of view. In other words, he said that if we would just go out of our way to want to understand other people, to seek to understand others, they will reciprocate. They'll want to understand us and where we're coming from. So I want to share with you this morning, as we talk about understanding, I want to share this for all of us. This is a message that we all need, but I especially want to talk to the husbands in the crowd, because guys, we especially need this message. We tend to be not good listeners. Maybe some of you are. But in general, men tend to do a lot more wanting to fix things than wanting to understand things. Okay, that's why we don't read the instructions before we just dive right in to whatever project that we're working on. I'm the world's worst at this. Mandy left, but Mandy will tell you, when we get a new piece of furniture from like IKEA, she puts it together. I'm okay with that. She puts it together. I know that sounds totally feminine of me, but she puts it together because I will get frustrated. I will get so frustrated because I don't really seek to understand the instructions. I just want to start putting it together, and I've destroyed a couple of pieces of furniture before because of my frustration. So Mandy puts all the furniture together. So guys, this is especially for us today. Husbands, especially for you. There's this old saying that if you want to make your mother happy, talk to her. If you want to make your father happy, listen to him. We tend to, by our very nature, want to be listened to more than we want to listen. There was a French priest a long time ago who made the observation that a lot of women become widows on their wedding day. And that's really sad. Well, you know what he meant by that, right? It's not that the husband dies on our wedding day, but he stops listening to her. When we date and we court and we're just totally enamored by this girl, we listen to every word she says. But then when we get married, we tend to be like, well, got her. What do I have to work on now, right? Mandy did not appreciate this illustration the other day because I told her I was joking. But she was telling me, Stephen, you need to take better care of yourself. You've been gaining a little bit of weight. And I was like, I know. And she's like, you don't eat good. I was like, I know. And I just kind of, a defense mechanism, right? I use humor as a defense mechanism. And I was like, hey, we're married. I don't have to take care of myself anymore. I've already got the hot girl. I don't have to, who cares if I get fat? And she did not like that. She didn't think that was very funny. And one time she told me that I didn't listen. And she said something else, but I don't remember. Really glad she's not in here right now. So the thing we're talking about this morning is simply this. We all want to be understood. Like, we want to be heard and understood on the heart level, right? We don't want people just to hear our words. We want people to hear our hearts. And so that's what we're talking about today. It's one of the most basic things that we need in life, to be understood. So today, in our second week of our series, What I Really Need, we're going to be talking about what I really need is understanding. What I really need is understanding. And as I've been thinking about this and praying about this message this week, I feel like there's something that's at the heart of all of this that we need to get. There's something that's at the heart of this issue that maybe we don't think about as often as we should. And it has to do with how we see people. And so I want to tell you a little story to hopefully kind of shed some light on this. In your notes, I've broken up the sermon into two different sections. First of all, how you can develop understanding the heart of the matter. And secondly, how you can develop understanding the practical stuff. Now, the practical stuff is what we always want to get to. when we're talking about a sermon or in a lecture or teaching, we always want to get to what can I do with this? Well, we'll get to that in just a second. But first, I want to talk about our hearts. I want to talk about what's at the center of this whole issue. And I told you guys last week, I've been reading through the Gospels. I just finished John last night. So over the past couple of weeks, I've read through the 4 Gospels, just straight through. And a couple of weeks ago, I started with Matthew. And as I read through the Gospel of Matthew, there was this certain phrase in those chapters that just kept jumping out at me. There was a certain phrase that it seemed like it was popping up every few chapters. And I want to tell you the story about this phrase and how, as I was reading, what it did to me. Jesus, at this point, you get about to Matthew chapter 9, and so you get through the Advent and Nativity, you get through the whole, all the stories that we read at Christmas, and you get into the life of Jesus. And around chapter 9, Jesus has been healing people all over the place. He's been going from town to town, healing and teaching and training his disciples. And at this point, he's calmed the storm that was on the sea with just his words. He said, "Peace, be still." And the storm was completely calmed. And he's just finished healing in chapter 9. He's just finished healing 2 violently possessed men who were possessed by a demon. And so we can imagine in chapter 9 of Matthew that Jesus is probably pretty tired at this point. He's been going and going and going and doing and doing. So he's probably pretty tired. He's been doing all this incredible work with probably very little time for rest. And on top of that, he's just healed a blind man and raised a little girl from the dead. So people are getting the word out about Jesus. People are starting to hear about this teacher from Galilee, this man from Nazareth, and they're starting to wonder about him. Did he really raise this little girl from the dead? Did he really cast out these demons? And so everywhere Jesus goes by now, a crowd is following him. You get to Matthew chapter 9, and everywhere Jesus goes, there's a crowd waiting for him, or there's a crowd following behind him. And we get to verse 36 of chapter 9, and the author says this. He says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Just to pause here for a second. Jesus has been healing and casting out demons and preaching and teaching and training his disciples and sending them out. So he's probably a little worked up. He's probably kind of tired. And then he sees these crowds of people. They're pressing in on him on every side. Anybody have a little personal bubble that you don't like people to get in, like you need 3 feet of personal space? Jesus did not have that convenience. Okay, people are everywhere. Wherever he goes, they're crowding around him. They're pressing him on every side. And yet it says when he saw all these people, he had compassion on them. He saw them as sheep without a shepherd. And I just felt like, look at all the people in this crowd and think about all the bad decisions that they've made. And Jesus knows their hearts. He knows the bad decisions that they made. Most of the people are seeking out Jesus for forgiveness of their sin or for healing. So Jesus knows what's in their heart. And yet he still has compassion on them. And I think that teaches us something about the heart of this issue of understanding. First of all, we tend to see the bad decisions that people have made. Jesus sees people who need direction. We look at people and we see the bad decisions that they've made. Jesus looks at the same people and just sees people who need direction, who need a shepherd. We see the result of bad decisions that people have made. How many times do we say to ourselves, do I say to myself, that person is just getting what they deserve? That person has dug their grave, now they've got to lie in it, right? They've made their bed, now they've got to sleep in it. We see the 16-year-old who just got pregnant, or the alcoholic, or the greedy business person that we work with, and it's easy to think that they just get what they deserve when bad things happen to them. And guys, let me tell you something. When you feel like you have some kind of moral high ground over someone else, you've lost sight of the gospel. When you put yourself up on the pedestal and you try to look down at other people and the bad decisions that they've made, and you say, they're just getting what you deserve, you've lost sight of Jesus. The moment you feel like you're better than someone else because of your morality, is the same moment that you've gone into something other than true Christianity. Jesus sees directionless people where we just see bad decisions. And Jesus goes on from here, from chapter 9. And I was reading through, I was like, wow, he had compassion on these people. And he goes on. He continues teaching and healing and casting out demons and performing miracles and forgiving sins. And in the middle of all of this, actually it's in the very middle of the Gospel of Matthew. It's in chapter 14, just a little bit later. In the middle of all of this, Jesus finds out, as he's giving and giving and giving, he finds out that one of his closest friends, John the Baptist, has been gruesomely murdered, beheaded, actually. Somebody comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, John the Baptist, the man who paved the way for you, Jesus, has been beheaded. He's dead at the hands of King Herod. And so we see in Matthew 14, Jesus gets this news in verse 13. It says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by a boat privately to a solitary place. He just wants to be alone. You know, like when you have something really bad happen, you just want to be alone, you want to get away. You ever have someone in your family or a close loved one who passed away and you just feel like you need to be alone for a while? That's what Jesus is doing. He says he withdrew by a boat. He got away from the crowds. He got on a boat to get away from the people and go to a solitary place. Hearing of this, though, in verse 13, hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And when Jesus landed on the other side of the lake, he saw a large crowd waiting for him. They were already there waiting for him, and he's just trying to get away to be alone. But they're already there waiting for him. And it says in verse 14, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Guys, Jesus was heartbroken right now. At this point in the story, his heart was breaking. He was intentionally getting away to mourn the loss of his close friend, John the Baptist. But the people kept coming after him. Put yourself in his shoes, right? Imagine what you would do if someone you dearly loved had just been killed and all you wanted to do was be alone. But people kept coming after you, people from your work or people that you know from different social circles. They keep coming after you and demanding things of you. How would you feel? People demanding things of Jesus, pressing in to see Jesus when all he wants to do is be alone to mourn. In this brokenhearted, mournful state, instead of getting upset that so many demands were being placed on him, Jesus has compassion again for these people. And I think that teaches us something about understanding. I think it teaches us that we tend to see our own hurt while Jesus sees the hurt of others. Jesus didn't just focus on his own hurt. He focused on the hurt of other people. You ever been around somebody, that only talked about what was wrong with their life all the time? I think we all know somebody like that, right? You know that person who's always, seems like no matter what you want to talk about, they always find a way to bring the conversation back around to the fact that their life is terrible and everything's bad and it's a terrible, awful, no good, very bad day and it's been that way for years, and they just always find a way to bring the pain or the conversation back to their pain. How do we feel about those kind of people? It's not good, right? I'm not saying that, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that we should keep our hurt bottled up inside. That's why we have one another. That's why we have the church. I believe that's one of the reasons that God gave us the church. I'm not saying that we should keep it all inside, but look at Jesus here. What can we learn from him? He is hurting. He is heartbroken. He just wants to be alone. But because of how much he loved, he was able to see these people who were coming to him not as a nuisance, not as a problem that just needed to go away, but as hurting people who needed understanding. A little while after this, Jesus keeps going. A little while after this, he walks on the water. He comes walking out to his disciples on the sea. He comes out walking to them on the water, and the disciples realize that he really is the Son of God, that he really is divine. And he goes on and he continues teaching and healing and casting out demons and training his disciples. And at this point, the religious leaders are really kind of getting worked up about Jesus. They're starting to conspire against him because he's rebuking them and telling them, no, you're wrong. This is really the way of God. They accuse Jesus of not really following the law of God, and Jesus rebukes them and gets angry at them. He calls them hypocrites, and he tells them, hey, this is the real meaning of the law of God. And shortly after that, after all of this is going on, we get to around chapter 15, and Jesus is going out now after all of this drama, after all this stuff's going on in his life. He goes out to teach, and a crowd of over 10,000 people follow him. They say there were 4,000 with not counting the women and children, so we can pretty well assume that there were over 10,000 people in this crowd following Jesus, wanting to hear him. And after he's finished teaching all these people, it's getting late in the day. His disciples tell the people to go away, go out to the towns, get something to eat, stay in the town tonight. And Jesus says this to his disciples in chapter 15, verse 32. It says he calls his disciples to him and he says, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days. Yeah, they've been following him 3 days at that point. And they have had nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. And he performs one of his greatest miracles. You might know the story. He takes a few pieces of bread and a few fish, and he gives it to his disciples to distribute. He blesses it, and he says, here, feed everyone. And something miraculous happens. As they begin to pass out the baskets of bread and fish, the baskets never get empty. And everyone in the crowd is fed until they are full. And I just got to thinking as I read that about Jesus and his disciples. You know, the disciples were looking at the need, and they said, Jesus, there's no way we can feed all these people. We've got to send them away. So they saw the need, but Jesus saw an opportunity for ministry. And that's what we tend to do as well. We tend to see the need of people, whereas Jesus sees an opportunity to minister. How many times have you felt overwhelmed at all the needs out there? You know, it's easy to slip into the thinking that we can't do anything about it. Yesterday I went and I do this from time to time. I went into downtown Renton, and it's one of my favorite places in the city, but it's not the best place in the world, you know. It's a little rough in downtown Renton, and I was just walking around the streets, and I was just looking at the people, and I was thinking and praying, and I was just like, there's so much need. There's so much need in our town. There's so much need in our city and in our community, and it's like, it's easy to think, there's so much need out there. What can I possibly do about it? Guys, I want you to know that the fact is we can't save the world, but Jesus can use us to help a few. This crowd of 10,000 people, the disciples had to be thinking, there's no way we can feed all these people. Send them away. Jesus, though, saw this opportunity for ministry, and he fed the crowd of 10,000. And a little bit after this, Jesus goes on. He continues teaching and healing and casting out demons and training disciples and calling people to follow him. And he goes on and he continues to tell he really gets serious with his disciples at this point. He tells them that he's going to be killed and he's going to be crucified. And 3 days later, he's going to rise. And the disciples don't really understand all this. But he begins teaching them about why all this has to happen and why he has to die. And Jesus knows that his death is coming, and it's coming soon. Yet he continues to give and give and give himself for people. And you get to Matthew chapter 20, towards the end of this gospel. And verse 34, well, let me start from verse 30. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And the crowd rebuked them. That's a key point here. The crowd rebuked these 2 men and told them to be quiet, but they shouted all the louder, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And Jesus stopped and he called to them, what do you want me to do for you? Lord, they answered, we want our sight. In verse 34, there's this phrase again. Jesus had compassion on them, and he touched their eyes, and immediately they received their sight, and they followed him. We tend to look at people, and especially people like the crowd was looking at these 2 blind men. We tend to look at people and see people who are beyond hope. Jesus looks at people who just need healing. When Jesus sees the people that you think are beyond hope, he sees them as people who just need a little healing, people who just need to have their eyes opened or have their hearts healed or have their physical illness healed. Like, we look around and we see people in our community and we think they are so far gone. Or chances are you've got someone in your family, or you've got someone that you work with, or someone that you used to be really close to, and they've just made a mess of their lives. Don't we all have that person in our lives that we look at and we think they're just beyond hope. They're beyond redemption. And maybe that's how you see them, as someone who's beyond hope and redemption. Maybe you feel like there's just no hope for them whatsoever. And the thought of what they're doing with their lives and the mess they've made of their life just makes you sick to your stomach. We all know people like that in our lives, don't we? How does Jesus see them? How does Jesus see that person that we see beyond hope? I believe that Jesus doesn't see them the way we do. I believe that Jesus sees them as someone who just needs healing, and he wants to heal them. So I'd suggest to you today, as we're thinking about the heart of this issue, when we're talking about understanding other people, I would suggest to you that the heart of all this is how we see others. It's all about how we see other people. Do we see them in the way our natural eyes tend to see them, or do we see them with spiritual eyes? Do we see them with the eyes of Jesus? So what I would challenge you today with is the thought that we can't be understanding to other people unless we are truly compassionate towards other people. Look, if you're bitter and cynical towards others, it's going to be really hard to understand where they're coming from. Or if you have a negative attitude towards other people, it's going to be really hard to be understanding and hear their heart. Jesus, though, looks at these same people that we look at with natural eyes. He sees them through his eyes, and he wants to heal them. So that's the heart of the matter, I think, as I was reading the Gospel of Matthew, of how we can see other people better, how we can understand them. We've got to see them the way that Jesus sees them, right? We've got to see them the way that Jesus sees them. So let's talk about some of the practical stuff, how you can develop understanding. Some of the practical ways you can do this, first of all, is don't be prejudiced by first impressions. You might want to write these down, because this is just kind of the day-to-day practical stuff. When we have the heart of the matter and we have the heart of Jesus and how we see others, then we can begin to live it out practically. Practically, I would say, don't be prejudiced by first impressions. There's a tendency for us in a first impression to immediately size a person up, right? And to say, you know what, they're good or bad, or I like them or I don't like them, or whatever it may be. And it affects the way we see them and the way we listen to them, the way we hear them, the way we think of them. So you might want to jot down in your notes John chapter 7. There's a scripture in John chapter 7 that says, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. Stop judging by mere appearances. And there's a few reasons for this. We tend to judge other people by our own self-image. We tend to judge people by our own self-image, and this is important. And let me just stop here long enough to say this. If you usually have a negative impression of people, there's probably a problem with you. Okay, when you meet new people, or you have a first impression of somebody, if your first impression of someone is usually negative, or you walk away from a first encounter with someone thinking of all the things that are wrong with them or the things that you don't like, there's probably something wrong with you and not everybody else. Okay, because we tend to judge others by our own self-image. You probably have a negative self-image of yourself, and you're projecting that onto other people. So be aware of that. Your self-image, if you're always critical with yourself and you're always down on yourself, you're probably going to be critical and down on other people. So be careful not to judge others by your own self-image. And don't be prejudiced by first impressions. I mean, a first impression is based on a single contact, and that's not fair. It's not fair to judge somebody based on one encounter. And then when we have a bad first impression, we tend to focus on that one thing that is wrong with the person, and that's not fair either. There are probably a lot of other good qualities about the person. So don't judge by a first impression. Secondly, become less self-centered in your listening skills. Focus more on the other person than focusing on yourself. Become less self-centered in your listening skills. As long as we're on our own agenda when we're talking to somebody, it's going to be tough to really hear their heart. So what I'm saying is that you need to have an other person focus when you're having a conversation or when you're listening. Paul said it best, I think, in Philippians chapter 2. He said, care about others as much as you care about yourselves. Care about others as much as you care about yourself. And Jesus said it best, as we talked about last week, didn't he? He said, what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor. Love others as you love yourself. So be less self-centered when you're listening to someone. Sometimes people say, and I do this too, sometimes people will say, I just can't remember people's names, right? Like, how many of you have trouble remembering names when you meet somebody for the first time? Most of us, yeah. Okay, you know why we really have trouble remembering people's names? It's not the fact that you forget their name in 5 seconds. It's because at that first impression, when you first meet somebody, you're so self-conscious about whether or not they like you, or whether or not they're understanding you. You're thinking, okay, how does my hair look? Or what am I going to say next? How am I going to keep this conversation going? How am I going to keep things flowing? And how am I going to keep things on a positive, in a positive light? How am I going to paint myself in a positive light? And all this is going on in the back of your mind while you're having a conversation with these people. And then you walk away and you're like, what was that person's name? That's why. Okay, because you're less focused on them and you're more focused on yourself. So become more focused on another person when you're seeking to understand them, when you're hearing them, than focused on yourself. Don't be so worried about making a good first impression or whether or not you're going to say the right things. Try to hear the person's heart. Hear them for who they are. So that's another thing that you can do practically. Thirdly, withhold criticism and judgment, especially in the beginning. Withhold criticism and judgment, especially in the beginning. When a person talks to you, hold off those critical thoughts. Hold off your judgment and your criticism, especially when you're first meeting someone. The Proverbs writer said, "He who answers before listening, that is his folly and his shame." So in other words, hold off. Don't try to jump in and judge somebody that you don't really know yet. Don't try to judge somebody when you don't know their heart. Okay? Don't be so critical and judgmental. The reason we don't need to jump in is because there's so many times when we're basing what we're believing on one encounter or on something we've heard, and we're making assumptions. We're assuming things about the other people, and that might not always be true. How many of you have ever had a situation in your life where you have a negative impression of someone, but then later you find out, oh, they're not so bad? Right? We all have done that before. I've done that before. So just try your best to withhold criticism and judgment in the beginning. Fourthly, listen with empathy. Listen with empathy. Now, there are several ways that you can listen to someone. The best way is to listen with empathy. That's what Jesus did so well, and that's what's at the heart of this issue. He looked at the people with compassion. That's empathy. That's true empathy. Empathetic listening is non-judgmental. It's not offering unsolicited advice. It's hearing and seeking to hear the other person's heart. Trying to seek the other person's heart. Number 5, be an active listener. Be an active listener. The Proverbs writer said, "The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out." It's a great verse. Let me give you a wonderful definition of listening. Listening, true listening, is wanting to hear. How many of you have ever, like the game of telephone that we played, you hear but you don't really listen? Okay, how many of us do that when we meet someone or as we're talking about someone in our own lives? Look, try to be an active listener. Try to really hear the other person and want to hear the other person. Number 6, recognize the healing power of a listening ear. Recognize the healing power of a listening ear. James 5:16 says, "Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed." Guys, listening and hearing somebody's heart and praying for them can heal them. It can heal them spiritually, emotionally, physically, whatever it might be. So recognize that power of when you really listen to somebody, there's power in truly hearing them. Because the other person feels accepted and the other person feels loved, and we become involved in the other person's needs, and there's healing that can take place. And that's related to the 7th and final practical thing that you can do to understand someone better. Do something about what you hear. Do something about what you hear. In other words, don't just become an active listener, become an active doer. Okay, Jesus said, become a doer and not just a hearer. In other words, whatever they're saying to you, if you can help them, if you can apply something to their life, help them do that. Help them do that. James told us to obey God's message and not to fool ourselves by just listening to it. What does that mean? It means that it may mean that when you listen to someone, it can mean several things. It may mean that when you're listening to someone, you scribble them a note when they walk away. You write them a note of appreciation or encouragement, and you send it to them that week. Or maybe you just, the next time you see them, you ask them about that situation they were going through. You say, "Hey, how are things going at your job? I know that was a difficult situation." When you do that for someone, it does something for their heart. They know that they've been heard. They know that they've been heard and understood, and that brings healing. That brings healing. So as we talk about seeking understanding, and trying to understand other people, there's two things. We got to understand the heart of the matter, and that's really having compassion for people. That's what's at the heart of it all, because that's what Jesus modeled so well. And secondly, we realize that there are some practical things that we can do as well, just day to day, to seek and let people know that we hear them and understand them. So let's stand together today. I'm going to ask Ben to come back up and lead us in a song of response. And maybe there's something in your life, in your heart today that you need to do something about that. As we're talking about this, and maybe you've realized that you really don't have a heart of compassion for people. And you see that example of Jesus and how he went even in the midst of his busyness. And the thing is, none of us are busier than Jesus was. Like, people were always demanding something of Jesus, and yet he continued to look at them with compassion, and he understood them. He wanted to heal their hearts. And maybe as you think about the example of Jesus, you look at your own life and you're like, that's really not me. I'm bitter and I'm cynical and I have a negative attitude towards people when I meet them, and there's something in me that needs to change. Ask God to help you with that today. Ask the Holy Spirit to come in and give you the heart of Jesus for people, and to give you the eyes of Jesus and how you see people. And ask him to help you just practically day to day to do some things to encourage people and let them know that they have been heard and understood and that you care for them. I just really feel like in our city, in our region, man, in the Pacific Northwest, people are desperate for this. People are desperate for this because we are so isolated from one another. And maybe, you guys who have grown up here, maybe you don't see it as much because it's just what you've always known. But as an outsider, as someone who's made my home here now, and as someone who sees this place as their home, I see so much brokenness in this region relationally, and how we relate to one another, and how we treat one another. It's like, we're so focused on ourselves and how others think of us that we build these passive-aggressive barriers between one another. And it's like, we'll ask, hey, how are you doing? But then we don't really care. We say, hey, how are things going at work? But then we don't really care. And I believe that the church, especially our church, can be an example to people of what it means to really listen and to really hear and to really understand someone's heart. Not just this Northwest passive aggressiveness where we're really just focused on ourselves and making it to the next level of whatever we're trying to do in life, but where we can really be a place of acceptance and healing and friendship, and a place where people come and they know that they are loved. I think that our church can be that kind of place in our neighborhood, in our city. I don't know if you guys see this when you're walking around. Like, I can just see it in people's eyes. Even here in Fairwood, I walk down to Starbucks, the place is full, right? Just cram-packed with people. And I'm just looking at them, and there's people sitting by themselves, and they're drinking their coffee, and they just look so sad. They look lonely. And there's other people who, maybe I see certain people who are there every day. And it's like, sometimes if I notice that they're a regular, I'll go over and I'll talk to them and say, hey, I see that you're in here a lot. And it's just like their eyes light up. They're like, somebody saw me. Somebody paid attention to me. And I think that's what God has just laid on my heart as I read through the Gospel of Matthew is, do I really have compassion for those people? Do I really have the heart of God for those people? So that's a challenge for all of us today. Are we seeking to have God's heart for people, or are we just trying to go through our day-to-day life and just get through? And I think that there's something better than that. It's the gospel. It's Jesus. It's being his hands and feet to see those who are lonely, those who are being misunderstood, those who aren't being heard. God can use you to help those people. God can use you at your work. He can use you at your regular coffee place, wherever you go. God can use you on your bus, on the train. God can use you to bring hope into someone's life. So let's think about this as we sing this song together and as we pray together. Let's ask God to open our eyes to see, like we sung just a few minutes ago, to open our eyes to see the people around us who need Jesus, who maybe just need to be understood, people who maybe just need a shepherd. Let's sing this song today, and then we're going to